All right, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started. My name is Sabine Perwaiz, and I have the honor of serving as the executive producer of TEDx Jacksonville. Welcome to Small Great Conversations with Pastor Michael Smith. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, TEDx Jacksonville is a nonprofit that is solely led by volunteers, and our mission is to open minds with inspiring ideas. The reason we started having these conversations was one, of course, in the world of COVID, we had to postpone our October conference, which is where Pastor Smith spoke about 6 years ago. And in lieu of that large event, we wanted to do something else, and we wanted to still have space for conversations. And so we decided to bring back several of our previous speakers that have spoken on our stage to have a more in-depth conversation around racism, their personal experiences, and what they've learned over the years, and just how their talk is still relevant today, despite the year in which they spoke. Today, we have the honor of having Pastor Michael Smith with us. He spoke in October 2014. And we have TEDx Jacksonville team member, Kinney Harold Adams, who will be moderating this conversation. Kinney is a jack of all trades. He is a United States Air Force veteran. He is a banker by trade by day and a musician at night. And you can see him around Atlantic Beach if you want to go see him perform.
I'd like to introduce Pastor Mike. I'm going to call him Michael. Pastor Michael has been advancing the cause of justice in his generation and beyond, and he's received multiple awards and citations for his work in addressing systemic issues of generational poverty and violence and race. So, Pastor Mike, I'd like to start our conversation off by asking, since that talk, which was in 2014, what has taken up your time, and what have you been doing since then?
Well, first of all, Kenny, thanks for having me on, and to Sabine and Doug and the whole team, just thank you for this conversation. Since 2014, I'd love to tell you that the issues of the talk were resolved and I moved on, but unfortunately, as I was watching, I thought, that could have aired last week with the relevance and the significance to really where we are now as a country. I've been doing the same thing. I always tell people I'm like the guy in the orchestra that plays the triangle. I've got my little tiny part, it's like the dun 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 dun, and then ding. That's my little ding there. So I've been playing my triangle, trying to nudge the world forward for my little corner of the world. And the talk was just a tremendous blessing in my life, a tremendous gift. It opened up doors that I never thought would open into worlds that I never even thought were interested. So I'm still on the front lines, sidelines, back lines, leading where I can, cheering where I can. And sadly, 6 years on, here we are.
Oh, yes, I see, because it seems like things don't change a whole lot. You can go over this issue from the beginning of our country till now, and we're still dealing with it. And even with the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we've had a lot of discussions on racism and Black Lives Matter. And do you think that right now, because of that, your talk and the idea you have has been amplified and brought any more weight or light on it?
Yeah, I do. At the core of the talk, really, people say, "Oh, you're the guy that talked about the music," and of course, the music was not the point at all. The music was just one of many kind of manifestations of this subtext, subcultural concepts that we have of Blackness, criminality, the cheapness of Black life, etc. The core of the talk was about violence and about our nation's historic and even present day hesitation to move towards any legitimate progress apart from violence. And so I was appealing to the conscience, appealing to hopefully highlighting the contrast in the real world and in the entertainment world, and then highlighting how the marketplace reveals our general perceptions about the role that Black people play in entertainment, the role they play in life, who they are as their pictures appear on our nightly news or in our newspaper. And so, yeah, I mean, as you talk about George Floyd, you talk about Breonna Taylor, you talk about all that's happening around our nation. It's really, Black Lives Matter. You could go back 60 years and replace Black Lives Matter with I am a man. I mean, it's still the same cry. It's still the same pleading to be seen as equals, to be thought of as equally human, to be given the full dignity, the full recognition of right to self-government, to autonomous self direction and full personhood. And why, unfortunately, it still takes violence to move the needle in that direction. And so I think very much so. Like I said, when I watched it, I thought, wow. First of all, I thought, man, who is that skinny guy on that talk there? I know they talk about the COVID-20. I think I put on the COVID-45 here. I don't know what that is, but anyway. Yeah. The second thing I thought is like, this is, I mean, you just look at the last 4 months in our country. It's still the marketplace being moved by violence. So Rick Ross being dropped from the label was not because Reebok had a revelation of consciousness. It was because the violence, the brand violence, economic violence, disruptive violence caused them to move. And now you have to ask yourself, as company after company puts out a BLM statement and we believe in Black lives, are they responding to an evolution of consciousness? Or are they responding to that mass movement in the marketplace?
Yeah, I like that economic violence. That's exactly what it appears that they're responding to. And the interesting thing about the talk on violence is with our protests, in my conversations with other people, especially other white people, the big thing that they have the hardest problem or time with is the violence that is associated with the protests. And so they can be all for what we're trying to protest for, but somehow the violence that's been portrayed or shown on the news makes it almost like they want to discount the actual cause and why people are out in the street. And it makes me wonder where they are thinking that the violence that they see on the screen outweighs the violence that happened to George Floyd or the violence that happened to Breonna Taylor. It's almost like a second, I guess, a separation of importance between, whether the police did it or whether, some private person who has whatever criminal issues does out of a mass group of people. It's like that violence gets amplified. So what do you think right now you would say to people who still believe that, racism has gone away and that it's not anywhere like it was in the past?
Well, there's a lot to unpack. First of all, I agree with you. My first thing would be, what is it that has moved you to speak? So if you watched Target get destroyed, or where I live in Atlanta, Lenox Mall get destroyed, and watching this violence on television, watching police cars and buildings and churches, be burned or business be burned, and observing that on television, that you were so offended by it, upset by it, frustrated by it, that moved you to commentary, that moved you to social media, that moved you to get involved. Some people even went down and carried a sign, Blue Lives Matter, or carried a sign, don't destroy our neighborhood, or whatever it is. And you have to ask yourself why that moved you. Whereas you have seen we can go back all my life, violence carried out by agents of the state against citizens, the unjust taking of lives by agents of the state, which is the fundamental basis of our nation, which even our framers said is against God, to deprive a citizen of life, to take life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness lightly, and to observe that. Michael Brown, George Floyd, we can just go on and on and on. And yet that did not move you. That did not move you to comment. That did not move you to take to the streets. That did not move you to go to social media and say, this is wrong. These are American citizens. And we can look at Ruby Ridge, we can look at Waco, we can look even, Richard Jewell, just came out, and we can say, man, that the power of the state coming down on the citizen, impeding in the life of a citizen, either by limiting freedom or happiness or taking their life, this is wrong. But somehow we're not able to empathetically connect that to the viral videos, people being shot in the back, et cetera. Because really, again, this goes to the talk, we're having a difficult time seeing us in them. And so our silence there, our underreaction there, prompts in these protests, which are really not connected to the riots. Now we see an overreaction, and to comment on the overreaction, how wrong this is. These are people's businesses. I just don't think you should take to the streets like that. We have to ask, as white people, and I know that's too big of a broom to try to sweep all white people in, but we have to ask ourselves, if this is the first thing that moved us to comment, if this is the first thing that moves us to voice our displeasure, the destruction of a Target, the destruction of a restaurant, that's what we have something to say about, while we watched Black people being unjustly taken by the state in silence. So that's what you have to identify, that disconnect. And this really, now, of course, I'm a pastor. I come from a spiritual world, frame, worldview, frame of reference. My issue is that if every baby, Kenny, if you and I emerged from the womb as equals, and we're born in a world, in a nation that we claim is equal, that we claim provides equality of opportunity, I know you cannot guarantee equality of outcome, but if over generations you consistently see disparity in outcome, you have to become skeptical on, have we really reached equality of opportunity? And if you believe we've genuinely reached equality of opportunity across the board in our country, yet we continue to see the suspicious pooling of these negative social ills, then you're placed at a crossroads. There's either something deficient in Blackness itself that cannot be remedied, or there's something deficient in our society, the cultural waters, et cetera, that we must address. And I think that's the disconnect, because that when they observe citizens' rights being taken by the state, Black citizens being killed, George Floyd having his neck held for 8 minutes in this cold stare, this, for whatever reason, this blackout, blank, cold-hearted stare while this man's life is snuffed out of him. If that doesn't move us, it's because somehow we keep saying that in this Blackness, there's something deserving of this. And you're tearing up our neighborhood now for what this Black guy deserved, or what Black people need to solve for themselves. So as a Christian, I cannot accept that there's something deficient in Blackness. My worldview is all men are created in the likeness and image of God. And because I can't accept that, because I cannot say, well, Blackness is just less than whiteness, it's deficient, it's hardwired towards self-destruction, then I must examine the shape of the world and the currents of the world and the leveling of the ground. And so I think when people comment, oh, it really is, it's there they go again. And the opportunist taking away from the legitimate cause. I mean, this has been going on as long as, that's how Dr. King lost his life, because he came back to Memphis a second time to prove that we could have a protest where there was no damage. And to try to constantly say our message should be able to be separated from the protesters, it's like I'm in Groundhog Day. It's rinse and repeat, the same detracting argument. But if you had nothing to say before this time, you got to ask yourself why none of these tears, none of these weeping families moved you until a Target was destroyed.
So what do you think, two things, with the movement we're going today, I'm wondering what your opinion is on how long you think this will last, and what do you have for bridging that relationship gap between whites and Blacks in this day and age?
Well, honestly, I grieve, because I think there is change. I think change is actually happening. I have had conversations with many white people who say, I never got it until now. And I've seen many Black people say, what were you missing? I mean, what were you missing? But we cannot go back in time. But if Brother Floyd, and I don't know if you've seen any of the videos of his brother talking about him, George Floyd's brother,
yes.
The purity of heart, the love that's there. If it is George Floyd, that is the tipping point, then I'm grateful. I don't understand what we've been doing since Trayvon and Jordan Davis, but I can't go back in time. So I am encouraged. I'm an eternal optimist. So I think what I would say is the hope is to not be afraid or distracted by the overreaction, if we've had years of underreaction, years of too slow, don't be moved by overreaction. Don't be moved by too quick. Things will settle. Things will settle, hopefully, not at an old norm, but at a new norm. I don't think you'll ever be able to totally stamp out discrimination, prejudice. You'll never be able to get rid of ignorance totally. You'll never be able to get rid of the tribalism totally. But I think that we can continue to move forward, continue to take leaps forward, and conversations like this. If we get one, you know, that my talk was seen, I don't know, the full talk seen close to 1 million people. Segments of the talk have been seen by like 6 or 7 million people. And the number of people that go, you know what? I never thought about it until I saw this. So changing one mind at a time. This is Doug and Sabine, their concept for TEDx is opening minds by this conversation. I'm not a fan of gradualism. I don't want to say, well, we'll get there, which is why citizens of goodwill, forget if you're red, yellow, brown, black, white, if you're a citizen of goodwill, pushing for, pressing the gas for a fully realized dignity and equality of all people is what we have to have. We have to hold out hope that one by one. But on the part that I'm grieved is if we do continue to get change by violence, that it goes months, Ahmaud Arbery, months before any action, and then there's violence, and then there's a response, that the soul of the power structure gets lost. You know, schools were not integrated apart from violence. Slavery did not end apart from violence. Buses were not desegregated apart from violence. Lunch counters were not integrated apart from violence. I mean, it's violence. So are we changing, or are we sitting down on the outside but standing up on the inside? Which is why in the middle of this violence, which is really, while the violence being broadcast, so are these leaps of branding, these leaps of inclusion, these leaps of corporate structural change are happening. We have to be grateful for them. But also the thin veneer, it's just now the N-word, and the hate is just barely below the surface. And now it's being pulled out, and you see it every day. Somebody snapping and just, you in this and this, I mean, just snapping. It's been there, but as these leaps are made in this violent, chaotic world that we're living in, so also surfaces the ugliness that lives on the inside. I have hope that people can change. Of course I do. I'm in that business. But I also think that until we can get honest about the problem, it's not going to happen. And I largely feel in this country, that's a failure of the pulpit, widespread failure of the pulpit to put emphasis on the full dignity and equality of all people, emphasis on the empathetic consideration and feeling of humanity as the basis for presenting the gospel of Christ. That in our 200-something year history has led to that same dysfunction now. But I will tell you this, there are pastors who never said a word about race that are saying it now. I just hope they're saying it not because of the risk of brand violence, but they're saying it out of a revelation of the ugly underbelly of our national story. So there's a lot to it, but conversations like this certainly help because it chips away, and you hope one day light breaks through.
Yeah, I would say that now I totally agree that my hope is that we are more addressing the soul of America and the moral character of America to have some empathy and compassion for the plight of Black America and people of color, brown and indigenous people especially. And that seems to be the major change for me that I'm hoping more people will look at themselves. I know even in my company where I work, I'm a Chase appraiser supervisor that does real estate appraisal work, reviews, and we're having this conversation in our company every day. And since it's happened, I recall one person after 1 week of this whole race conversation making a comment, isn't this enough already? Or, you know, aren't we over this already? And of course,
we gave you February.
me being the only Black person in the meeting, I couldn't not say anything. Whereas I know maybe a few years ago, I might have just let that go because I would not have felt like I had any kind of support from anybody else in the room. But in this particular instance, I spoke up and told her, no, this is not going to be something that goes away in a week, you know, because it's something we're trying to change long term. And that does start with your workplace. Since we spend a third of our life in the workplace, you know, without that, changing, it really won't happen. I would say that that's one of the bigger opportunities we have, is that everybody wants to get a paycheck. It's the same reason why the military was able to have greater strides in racial movements and realities there, and be more accepting, is because that everyone knows you have to start thinking that way, and you have to act that way. So now, since we're beyond the whole point of just actions, you know, we had a period of time where people knew how to behave. And now with, you know, the current situation with our current president, it let the floodgates out of, no, I don't have to hold that back anymore. I can actually say what I think and believe. But to your point, we can't correct what we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, I agree. You know, sometimes we get grieved because the ugliness rises to the surface. But if it doesn't rise to the surface, I don't know how else to deal with it. When President Obama was elected, I was pastoring in Jacksonville at the time, and I cautioned my church, and I talked to them. I said, his presidency will be, the phrase I used was a great revealer. I said, he is not going to cause the racial discord in our nation. This is like the very first week he was elected. I talked about this on a Sunday. I said, but his election is going to highlight things that we thought were behind us, that were really not behind us. So acting as that revealer. And of course, the current tenor in our nation, I think, is just a continuation. And honestly, as ugly as it is, you know, on one hand, I say it's ugly. It's actually less bad than it's been in a long time. And I think you say, well, how could it possibly be less bad? Because there are more for us now than I think than have ever been. There are more vocal people now than I think have ever been. We're making more marketplace strides. That's the entire point in the TED Talk about the Pepsi logo being on the front of a bus. That bus discriminated against blacks, and Pepsi's brand in 1955 could calmly, peacefully be associated with that sort of action, and nobody raised an eyebrow. Well, we've moved past that. Pepsi could no way have their brand associated with that, and going further and going further and going further. And I wonder now, as people say, oh, there they go again, you know, they're the black people are upset about this, or there go the blacks are upset about this, whatever. I try to say to myself, had I lived in 1955 and you know, talked about the disruptive king and the SCLC and all they're all just causing trouble, would I have had the clarity to go, well, yeah, I mean, yeah, maybe it's a lot of disruption and maybe there's damage to property and everything, but they should be able to ride the bus. But they should be able to enter the bus terminal, but they should be able to sit at the counter. And people have to ask themselves now, what side would you have been on in 1955, 1958, 1960, 1963? What side of the event would you have been on? And so now what we say is white people, masses of white people say, oh, I totally would have been fine with buses. I totally would have been fine with schools. I totally would have been fine with drinking fountains. I totally would have been fine with the Voting Rights Act. But, and in that but is where we have to evaluate ourselves in the workplace, at home, houses of worship, day in, day out community. Are we coming down, if we're going to err, are we erring on the side of pushing for a more fully realized dignity, equality for all citizens? Or if we err, are we erring out of frustration of, well, there they go again? And again, there they go again speaks almost summarily of, well, their cause is ridiculous. Their point is nonsensical. It should just be dismissed. It's all political. It's the Republicans. It's the Democrats. It's the left. It's the right. Whatever smokescreen can be used. But from the empathetic side, to sit across from a coworker, to sit across from a friend, to sit across in houses of worship or even in the community, and to see the full humanity. See, that's the issue. It's seeing the full humanity. And, you know, this to me is the core. This to me is the essence of what has to happen, because, you know, you can make all sorts of policy, but policy is empowering bitterness. I mean, the ridiculousness of some of the commentary, the ridiculousness of some of the responses to people basically crying, I am going to react like you react. I'm going to be upset like you're upset. So you have a protest or whatever it is, a gathering, and all these white militia guys show up with all these weapons. And then the next day, 50 black militias show up with all these weapons. What are they doing? They are doing what you would do. And to give space in your mind for that same claim to equal ground, to equal rights, to equal personhood, to equal right to defend life. And the core of our country is not allowing the power of the state to come down unjustly on the individual. And how on the right conservative Tea Party Republican core is the government having too much power of the individual, how no one was able to align that with Colin Kaepernick's pleading for additional enforcement of laws, whereas the state was unjustly trampling upon the laws of its citizens. Getting those two sides to talk without deflecting, redirecting, dismissing, that is the essence. And somebody's got to be the English interpreter of English to try to explain you're saying the exact same thing and to get those values aligned. But when you add race, party, etc., it's like I can't even hear the issue. I dismiss you right out of hand because you must be one of them or you must be fed by that. And so we go to our corners and I zero into my curated media feed and my curated Google searches, and you zero into your curated news feed and Google searches, and we come back out with more ammunition, not to see each other as more fully human, but to fortify our position and why we should dig our heels in and not change. And so it's going to take 1,000 layers of attack to peel this thing back, and you got to hit it from the racism side, the prejudice side, and the discrimination side.
Yeah. Do you think the idea is prevalent for white people that if they give up something along equity, that they will lose something? So that's some zero game where, if we let Black people and people of color have equal rights, then we will not have the same rights we have.
Yeah, I don't understand. I mean, I understand that. My grandfather, so this will tell you, and I love my grandfather like I love my nation. Love him enough to want better from him and for him, and love him enough to see his humanity despite the ugliness. My grandmother was a church-going woman. She was 16, he was 26. They got married a long time ago. And she actually got her pastor fired from a church because the pastor would not baptize her Black friend. And the pastor said, well, she can get saved here, but she's got to get baptized down the street. And my grandmother got the pastor fired and ended up leaving the church. My grandfather never set foot in church a day in his life. He pulled me aside when I was 12 years old. There was a yard crew, landscaping crew working out behind my house. And he said, come here, I want to tell you something. And I said, yeah. And I didn't have a father growing up the first part of my life, so he was my dad. And he pulled me over and said, do you see that Black guy out there? I said, yeah. He said, let me tell you something. He said, I don't care what kind of car he drives, what kind of clothes he wears, what kind of house he lives in, how much money he makes. He will never be as good as you because he'll always be, and he used the N-word right there. And this was a molestation of soul. He said, don't tell anybody what I just told you, but I want you to remember that for the rest of your life. So that is my grandfather, who in my parents' house, my mother's house, with all her siblings, was raised under the white woman who left a church because of the discrimination, and a man who never went to church and held on to that prejudice. Mm-hmm. You have to wake that up. I mean, I'm the first generation of people born after civil rights with the hangover and the residue of these deeply held beliefs that were passed down generationally and absorbed environmentally. And even though I would have rejected the overt prejudice and said, oh, that's not me at all. In fact, when I went from Orlando to College Park and I was surrounded by Black people, I'd left an all-white world to an all-Black world, I was shocked as to how much I had absorbed in my language, my vocabulary, my mindset, my belief about the otherness of Black people. And I'm telling you, pastoring a church, being an associate pastor of a 20,000 member church when I don't think there was 300 white people in the whole 20,000 members, those seeds of deception and bitterness, it's to quote something from the Third Reich, the Blut und Boden, right? The blood and soil of who I am as a white American. This stuff is in my nostrils. Mm-hmm. And so when I see a pool party with a police officer with his knee in a 14-year-old Black girl's back, holding her down while another guy's got a gun keeping the people away, I have to pause generations of thought that have been imparted into me and passed down to me, because my first instinct from my forefathers is to say, there they go. The white people were probably enjoying a calm day at the pool until they showed up. That's the voice of my progenitors that comes up in my head. And I have to pause that to go, wait a minute. I have learned more and experienced more and contacted the full dignity and equality of Black people I was a youth pastor. I mean, I can't ever be black or know what that's like, but as close as a white person can get immersion in that world for, almost 30 years.
Yeah.
And yet, and still, these echoes are there. So when you talk about the type of progress, what am I going to lose? This is generational conditioning that something must be protected and preserved at the cost of the fully realized dignity and equality of Black people. It's a story as old as America itself. It's based in money. It's based in mammon, what the Christian worldview calls Babylon, the market system whereby I gain by a smaller marginalized group losing. And to ask somebody to shake that away, we saw it in Charlottesville, we will not be replaced. And that's a smallness of worldview. It's a smallness of expectation. I certainly don't see how a person that professes faith in any sort of God can think that way. But I also think it's delusional. If you're not paying attention, it's changing already.
Right.
And we don't have to be in the majority to carve out a full place for the dignity of the minority, because soon we're going to be the minority. And the track record of having carved out an equitable system might be the last pro-white move that white people have, to say, hey, let's move this so that it's us rather than us versus them, because in 20 or 30 years, we may very well be, in fact, in the minority, and the legacy we'll want to call upon is how we've established ourselves in an equality-based structure of the country versus trying to preserve the dysfunctional discriminatory base. And so, again, I mean, these are the deepest issues that we possibly can have, and we got to chip away at them on all fronts and every way we can. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I totally agree. That's some excellent points. We want to move to some questions from our virtual audience. So I think Sabine was going to give me those. I think the first, I see a couple questions here. So it says, you mentioned advertisers in your talk and the recent support from corporations for Black Lives Matter. How do we hold these corporations accountable?
Well, you know, there's the marketplace side, there's the market share side, there's the economic side. I think we've got to move towards identifying citizens of goodwill in the marketplace and identifying corporations of goodwill that deserve our goodwill within that marketplace. Case in point would be what's happening now with the Washington football team, who is not only finally going to change the name from Redskins, but also I saw an article the other day that minority ownership wants the majority ownership out. My first thought would have been for the majority ownership to have a revelation of doing the smallest, kindest gesture from the power structure to just give some tip of the hat to the full dignity and equality of original Americans. That guy would have still been worth multiple billions of dollars with a multiple billion-dollar franchise, and the smallest tip of the hat to say, I see you. That's what I want, because what has to happen otherwise is violence against the brand, violence against the marketplace, violence in the marketplace, violence economically. And what you see is the cry from 110 native original tribes, indigenous peoples, for years to try to get the name changed, nothing. But when the Black Lives Matter movement aligned itself with the change of that team, within like 1 week, it changed. $620 billion of equity from FedEx and its partners going to the NFL, and not based on a change of heart, but based on a change in economic pressure. So from my pastoral view, we've got to get to the souls of the people and get them to understand why. But if you're going to say we just stay with the way we have, how do we deal with the advertisers? They should not enjoy our goodwill if they are not on the side of the fully recognized dignity and equality. Listen, let people make whatever music they want. I got music about, you know, going to Browntown and killing the blacks and all this other kind of stuff. Walmart's name should not be on it. It should not be on it. And if Walmart wants to continue to enjoy the goodwill of the American marketplace, then the canary is letting them know the air in here has to change.
All right. So I'm looking to see if we have any other questions. And from what you're saying, I would say that you know, the hands of change are really strongly, or as strongly, in the corporate market as it is with the government. Even though the government can address a lot of systemic issues that they created themselves. Mm-hmm. So
sure.
So that seems to be the more of the revelation today, is the power of corporations to make some changes.
You have to, because America is money.
So I got another question says, what do you suggest we do as individuals when we live and operate in a homogeneous environment? So I assume that's more like, you know, you live in an all-white environment, or mostly that's. And how can we help momentum? How can we help keep momentum in the movement?
I'll give you a very insightful, hopefully quick story here, because I know we're running out of time. I was growing up in my mother's ad agency, working there over the summers. They were trying to negotiate some print prices, $250,000 print prices. My mom, who was the CEO, founder of the company, was not happy about the price. And she said to the person in accounting or whatever it was, the purchaser, she said, look, call them back, Jew them down, and get a better price. And this woman looked at my mother and said, what'd you say? She said, call them back, Jew them down, and get a better price. And my mother said, I'm sorry, does that offend you? And she goes, yes. She said, are you Jewish? She said, yes. She said, I apologize, I didn't mean anything by it. And I'm standing there at 14 years old, have lived the phrase, Jew them down, my whole life, because it has context and meaning to me that was never challenged until it was uttered in a challenging environment. So sometimes in a homogenous environment, we're in an echo chamber where the things that we say, no one ever lets us know that they're wrong. So my advice to that person who's asking the question is, you stay informed, you continue to interact. Thank God for online. Thank God for what you can read. Thank God for reading the stories of other people who have been through situations, and translate that in the most powerful way you can at dinner tables, family reunions, coffee tables, water cooler conversations, even in an all white world or an all red or an all yellow or brown world, because you might be the voice to challenge within that echo chamber. And what you say is, you know, I heard that phrase you said, you know, I actually read something about that the other day. Do you know that has a thing and what it was really meant and what it really did? And what will happen to them is hopefully what happened, the same thing happened to me, what happened to them, your eyes start to open, you say, oh my God, I had no idea how deeply ingrained this stuff was in me. So even if you're in a world where you feel like there's no one to speak out on behalf of, you can speak to people that are within your world and enlighten them. And they're probably fortified, most likely, in the media deceptions that there's no real problem here. But as you keep letting your light spill over at your dinner table, you know, et cetera, I think that's even what may seem insignificant. It's a rock in the middle of a pond that'll ripple. You know, they tell two friends and they tell two friends and they tell two friends.
Pastor Smith, Sabine here. We have 2 minutes and we have a lot of questions because you are clearly resonating with people. So I'm just interjecting really quickly to say if the next few could be just really quick responses so we can be respectful of your time.
I will hit them as quick as I can. Yes, ma'am.
Kenny, if that's okay with you, I'll just read it out loud, or can you see them now?
Yeah, that would help because I don't think I see them here.
Okay. All right, so the next question that we have is, how do we highlight the moral goal of Black Lives Matters and minimize the political aspect to gain more support?
Reframe the phrase. Black Lives Matter is just a 2020 phrase for I am a man. You know, people can vote Republican or Democrat and easily distance themselves from the issues within those parties that they disagree with or those candidates. You can do the same with Black Lives Matter. You don't have to embrace the nonprofit organization's entire corporate worldview to make a statement that the dignity of Black life is equal to white life.
Great. What specific actions or policy changes do you recommend?
Mandatory is tough because it's violence. Ongoing conversation, opportunities for ongoing conversation, school, houses of worship, workplace, libraries, wherever it can happen, because I think the more we get face-to-face to each other instead of the curated, skewed, two-dimensional view that we have each other, I think policies that will push towards empathy and in person are healthy policies to have.
Can you talk about how people struggle to step over an emotional wound? The idea of healing an emotional wound can open up the door to empathy and seeing the world from someone else's perspective.
It's a big thing. They're saying hurt people. I don't know if that's probably true. You've got to be honest with yourself. There is some compartmentalization, some dissonance that can take place. Sometimes you can learn your own healing through the pain of others. One of the things I'm shocked about is I talk about equality for Black people, the white people that say, you don't know what happened to me at my school, you don't know what happened to my child. Maybe even not in common pain, but in the recognition of the common experience of pain, there can be some healing and some conversation that takes place.
Last question from me before we go to Kenny's last question. What do you think when people scream reverse racism?
I think reverse racism there can be reverse discrimination, there can be reverse prejudice. Racism is, there can be reverse bigotry. Racism is a function of the power structure. Only the power structure can operate in racism. So until blacks or brown people are in the power structure, in the majority, there cannot be a such thing as reverse racism. Certainly somebody can hate white people. That's discrimination and prejudice. But reverse racism is a description of the powerful, and the minority cannot, those in the minority cannot be racist against the majority. It's a complex thing, but I hope that gives a little insight.
Yeah, it does. So I think we'd like to end this with the last question is, what keeps you going? And you did answer this, and what are you hopeful about? Is there any last thoughts on what you're hopeful about, or what keeps you going?
What keeps me going is, it's going to sound really bad. Black folks have been very good to me. Much of my family and friends are Black. To enjoy that friendship, to enjoy that family, to enjoy that support, and I'm talking all over the world, on 5 continents I've been, and yet to be silent feels wrong. Second thing that keeps me going is, I don't know what I would have done at a lunch counter in 1962. I don't know what I would have done at a lynching in 1910. Those opportunities weren't presented to me. Before God, the Bible tells us that God will judge us based on our seeing and feeling and using our power on behalf of the powerless. I didn't have a decision to speak out against those other things. I do have a decision to speak on the side of right now. And when I stand before God, I hope in my generation, I spoke up for what is on His heart. That's what I believe.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Pastor Michael Smith. We've been talking to for the last hour for our TEDx great conversations, small great conversations on our racism. It's been a distinct pleasure to be able to moderate this talk. You are definitely a really insightful and largely experienced person when it comes to our state of racism in this country, and your lived experience is something that clearly has been able to get you to the place that you are today. And my last thought is that we all have internalized white supremacy in us, no matter who you are. And yes. I think that is the driving force that we have to get out of every individual in the world, because it's been placed there over the last 500-600 years since colonialism took over the globe, and you'll find it in all those places.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Sabine, I think you want to say a last word?
Yeah, no, thank you both so much. That was mind-blowing. I mean, the commentary that's taking on in both Facebook and our group chats and all. Thank you both so much for having this honest conversation. And for everyone watching, this is recorded. We will edit it down and share on our website with you all. So if you registered for us with us, then you'll get that link. Otherwise, have a great rest of your weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.